And I'm pretending to pick randomly. Professor Bob Pease, would you care to grace the lectern once more? Make Bob very welcome, folks.
So I've barely had time to recover from the last one.
That's showbiz, Bob. That's showbiz.
I'm also tempted, rather than, as part of me would have loved to have had some engagement and response, and I'm sorry there wasn't an opportunity for that. But so if anyone wants to come and talk to me at lunchtime, then please do so in terms of the earlier presentation. Hopefully there'll be more time to talk about this one. And in many ways, the two presentations are connected. To talk about privilege is also to talk about masculinity. I want to start by giving, and I'm going to really race through a few of these slides because some of this material has been covered. And Maureen spoke at length about the history of the connection between gender and disasters in some detail yesterday. But disaster studies has been a field that's been very slow to engage with the issue of gender, and it really, as Maureen said, it wasn't until the late 1990s that there was any start. The field of disaster studies started to critically engage and reflect on the relevance of gender, and that early work focused very much on the different ways in which men and women responded to disasters, the different impact that disasters had on men and women, and there was a danger in some of that early work that those gender differences were essentialised in some way, there was some of that early work had a very limited framing in its understanding about gender. Understandably, most of the focus on gender and disasters focused on women and women's increased vulnerability to disasters. There wasn't much attention given to men, although, as Maureen noted, in more recent years, men and masculinities has come on the agenda. And much of the disaster and gender work has been focused on the impact of disasters rather than the prevention of disasters as such. And so it was in response to that context that Elaine Anderson, who has written extensively about women and disasters, and we met at a conference that Deb Parkinson organised a few years ago, where there was a launch of the work that Deb and others had done on the impact of the Black Saturday bushfires on men, and particularly trying to explain ways in which men responded to those fires and in some cases became more violent towards their intimate partners. And Elaine and I met at that conference and started talking about this idea about maybe we need to really start to think about a book. And so through a range of email exchanges, we developed a proposal, managed to get a contract, and invited a number of contributors from around the world to contribute chapters. And in fact, Deb and Christina both got chapters in this book. Now, there is a flyer for the book I think there's a flyer for the book in the conference kit, although the flyer, that refers to the hardcover edition, and there is a paperback edition that'll be coming out in June, July of this year, much cheaper than the hardback. So the book's comprised of 19 chapters across 12 countries, and it explores 4 key themes. And I want to say a little bit about each of the 4 key themes that the book addresses. Critical masculinity studies in disaster, the high cost of disaster for men, diversity of impact and response among men, and transforming masculinity in disaster management. So what does it mean to bring a critical masculinity studies lens to disasters? The first thing I think we have to say is that we need to move beyond conventional understandings about gender. And we need to move beyond the kind of socio-biological framing, which basically sees gender as flowing from XY chromosomes and sort of an aggression advantage that argues that men are somehow naturally more aggressive because of the way in which they are biologically conditioned and shaped. And also we need to move beyond the kind of sex role theories which focus on the way in which masculinity is learned, because they don't really deal with power and inequalities and differences between men, and also the impact that men's dominance has on women. And so this kind of critical masculinity approach talks about gender as something that's done, it's enacted, it's practiced rather than just a state of being, and it takes place in the context of broader social structures, which some of us who were involved in the 70s and 80s used to call patriarchy, and I still like to use that kind of language. And it talks about the way in which gender is intersected with other social divisions like class, race, ethnicity, ability, sexuality, and geopolitical location. And so the key dimensions of masculinity through this critical masculinity lens are that there are multiple masculinities arising from different cultures and social divisions, and these different positions in relation to power, so issues of class, race, ethnicity, create inequalities between men. That is institutionalised and embedded in organisational structure. So it's not just embodied within individual men. We can talk about the masculinity of government, of the state, and when we talk about critical masculinity studies. They are embodied by men and they're enacted by men. Men do masculinity in particular ways. But also they're fluid and open to change in response to wider changes in society. So this kind of, the idea of a critical masculinity lens is to actually broaden out the way in which we think about gender. And very often I think we talk about and think about gender in very limited and constraining ways. Rowan Connell talks about hegemonic masculinity, which I made some reference to in the early presentation. Culturally dominant in a given setting, idealised, promoted as desirable attainment for young men to strive toward, presented as heterosexual, aggressive, authoritative and courageous. Men and boys continually measure themselves against this notion of hegemonic masculinity. Power over women are signifiers of this form of masculinity, and it's associated with aggressiveness and capacity for violence. So this was the kind of lens that we were using and invited contributors to use as they started to explore the impact disasters have on men, and also what that meant for women as well. And so some of the chapters, again, some of these issues have been talked about in earlier presentations, so I'll skip over some of them. A number of the contributors talked about the different relationship to risk that men and women have. And not only in terms of readiness to whether to stay and fight the fire or to leave, and not only that did that have implications for men, but during the Black Saturday bushfires, of course, as Deb will talk about more in detail, that had horrific consequences for their families as well, as partners and children stayed with the men to fight the fires. Disasters impact men's livelihoods through the loss of the provider role, and that has an impact on men who define themselves through their paid work. Men's experience of trauma in the aftermath of disasters is also shaped by masculinity, and I've done some research on deployment trauma, interviewing peacekeepers who've come back from war zones, and there are a lot of similarities between the kind of experience of trauma. And trauma for men is often felt as something that's unmanly, because it's to do with men like to be in control, and when you're traumatised, you lack control. So men find that as a threat to their gender identity as well. And so we see high levels of alcohol use, suppression of feelings, failure to live up to certain ideals of masculinity, emphasis on stoicism, rugged individualism, increased levels of violence against women. And in some ways, one of the areas that I think is underdeveloped, and I think we need to explore, is that I actually think we as men need to allow ourselves to experience vulnerability more. And I think many of the problems associated with our role in the world is that we think of ourselves as men as being invincible, as being invulnerable. And I think the more we embrace our sense of human vulnerability, we may then start to think about our relationship to the planet and nature in different ways. And a number of the contributors start to look at the impact that disasters have more broadly on gender relations. How does gender organise the experiences of men and women on the ground? There's what some refer to as a glass escalator effect, in which men come to the fore and play leadership roles in sort of disaster recovery, and often that's connected to the different caring responsibilities that men and women have. as well. And so the question is often addressed as how do disasters impact on gender relations more broadly? To some extent they destabilise gender relations, and they threaten sort of traditional gender roles. And yet what we also see is that patriarchal gender relations are still very highly resilient in the face of disasters, and on the whole they seem to entrench patriarchal gender relations rather than challenge them. We have a number of chapters looking at the impact of a number of different population groups, and this conference, theme of this conference is to address those greater vulnerabilities. And so I won't say too much more about that here, but I want to kind of really move to kind of open up a question about is the key concept. I mean, I know diversity is again another key concept that underpins this conference. And I really think that we shouldn't take these concepts for granted, and I think we do need to problematise them in some way and interrogate them. Because often when we talk about diversity, we're really talking about individual characteristics that are to do with sexuality or age or race or gender. And very often diversity and becoming more conscious and aware of diversity is also a strategy to be able to better manage those diverse groups, to manage them and to control them. And sometimes the language of diversity takes our attention away from the structural dimensions of the issue that are actually excluding and marginalising those particular people. In some ways, diversity is also a safer way of talking about these issues than talking about patriarchy or sexism or racism or white supremacy. These are much more challenging concepts. Diversity is a softer way in which we can talk about this. And so I much prefer the language of intersectionality. And I was pleased to hear Maureen refer to this sort of more academic concept, because I think intersectionality is another way of naming the issues, but by putting a focus on structures and systemic structures that actually exclude people rather than the characteristics that people inhabit. The final section of the book, we started to look at various strategies for change, and just to say something briefly about 5 of them. There's an acknowledgement throughout the chapters that firefighting and emergency services are male-dominated organisations, often operating on a command and control structure, male-dominated, often misogynist and sexist, and we really need to shift and challenge the sexism and misogyny that are embedded within those services. We also need to challenge the structures and ideals that shape risk and the greater propensity for men to place themselves and their families in risky situations. We need to educate practitioners in emergency services about gender and the way gender is enacted and done, so that emergency services personnel can become more gender cognizant. We need to look at the prevention of men's violence, the aftermath of disasters, by understanding what is it about disasters that develop a greater propensity for violence. And finally, and more importantly, we need to find ways of engaging men in campaigns for sustainable development and gender equality. And I think we need to bring some of the work that's been done in other areas around particularly men's violence against women, where we see an increasingly greater acknowledgement of the importance of feminist analysis and pro-feminist engagement with men. I think we need to bring that into the emergency services sector as well. So I'll stop there.